Hello, I'm Emily Angwin. This is the News Hour live from Doha. We're bringing you continued special coverage of the war in Gaza coming up in the next 60 minutes. Killed while trying to flee, 70 civilians are hit by Israeli strikes on what was supposed to be a safe route to southern Gaza. A humanitarian crisis intensifies. The World Health Organization says moving patients from overwhelmed hospitals is a death sentence and wants the evacuation order reversed. A group of journalists, including Al Jazeera's team, is hit by an Israeli strike in southern Lebanon. A Reuters cameraman has been killed. And diplomatic efforts intensify as the Emir of Qatar meets the US Secretary of State in Doha. It's 21 GMT, that's midnight in Gaza, where Israel's army says it's carried out small-scale ground raids that have involved infantry and tank units. There are scenes of fear and panic that have enveloped the besieged territory. At least 70 Palestinians, mostly women and children, were killed by Israeli air sanctuary on what was supposed to be a safe route out of northern Gaza, heading south. 1.1 million Palestinians are now in what's been called an impossible situation after Israel has ordered the evacuation of everyone in the north, including densely packed refugee camps and hospitals. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres spoke about the situation in Gaza a short while ago.
After days of airstrikes, the Israeli Defense Forces have ordered the Palestinians in Gaza City and its surroundings to move to the south of the territory. Moving more than 1 million people across a densely populated war zone to a place with no food, water, or accommodation, when the entire territory is under siege, is extremely dangerous and, in some cases, simply not possible.
Inside Gaza for us, but first let's go to Hoda Abdelhamid in West Jerusalem. Hello there, Hoda. What have Israeli authorities been saying about these most recent ground raids?
Well, an Israeli military spokesman said that these incursions happened and the soldiers are back into southern Israel. We don't know exactly when they happened, but we suppose over the last 24 hours. Now, the Israelis are saying that that was to try to collect as much as information that they could on the fate of those Israelis that were taken captives by Hamas, and also to destroy a Hamas cell that had anti-tank capabilities and that was firing from across the border. But I think what the military is not saying, that it's also gone across into Gaza in that bordering area to clear a path in case of a ground invasion, which seems more and more likely. They need to get information about what's happening on the other side. They need to make sure that there are no Hamas cells or Hamas fighters or Hamas military capabilities on the other side of the border, so that when they start rolling the tanks, they can find a clear path. Now, we don't know when this ground invasion could be, but it could very well be in the next few hours or the next few days, but certainly it is approaching. So Israel would need that kind of on-the-ground intelligence to figure out what's happening on the other way and to make sure that when that starts, the path is clear.
And Hoda, you're in West Jerusalem. You've been there for several days now. What's the mood like on the ground? Well,
I mean, if you've ever been to Jerusalem before, or actually to Israel before, you know that things are very different. The streets are empty. Many businesses are shut. There's lots of anger and there's lots of worry. So really, people, you know, stocked up on food or staying at home or following the news. There is tension. And if you're an Israeli, you want to see your government act as quick as possible. There is obviously many calls for revenge. Israelis do support the heavy-handed methods applied by the Israeli army at the moment in Gaza. Many are calling really for the army to this time finish off Hamas inside Gaza. There's also anger towards the government, especially from those people and the residents of in those communities that were bordering Gaza. Many of them still want to hear answers from the military, who didn't come and save them and who didn't react quick enough. In one instance, for example, the military reached them 20 hours after this attack started, which was about a week ago. In a few hours, it will be a week ago, Saturday morning, pre-dawn last week. So there is that too. If you're a Palestinian, you're also very worried about revenge attacks. I spoke to many Palestinians here in occupied East Jerusalem. They are worried that they will pay the brunt of what happened, what was carried out by Hamas. They are extremely worried, and by and large, they are staying indoors too. I heard parents tell me that they don't allow their young children to be on the streets. They say that they're extremely worried if, you know, they have a teenage boy, because he could get infuriated by what he's watching on television and maybe, you know, find himself in trouble on the streets. So all that is factoring in, and everybody's waiting to see whether this ground invasion will happen or not, whether there will be more tensions along the northern border. So I think we're kind of in a wait-and-see pattern. The country is entering maybe a phase 2, as the bodies have been recovered in all those villages along the border. The funerals are happening on a daily basis, but the country is entering into a new phase. And somehow, even if Israel says it's going to be a much longer war, it is uncharted territory, because all the wars that happened before with Gaza, and there have been at least 5 since 2009, they were limited in time. This time, and they were called military operations. This time, the government here is very clear. He calls it a war. They say that it will last as long as it needs to last. So people are worried.
OK, thanks so much for the update. Hoda Abdelhamid in West Jerusalem. Let's head to Gaza now, where the combined populations of North Gaza and Gaza City have been told their only safety is south of the Wadi Gaza. But those regions are just as heavily populated and also subject to Israel's bombing campaign. In Rafah, the southern border to Egypt is closed due to those attacks. Even if it was open, it would remain closed to Palestinians from Gaza. Let's bring in, or rather, our correspondent, Yumna Saeed, has made the journey from Gaza City to Khan Yunis in the south and filed this report.
We're heading now. Our bunch is 3 cars. This car in front of us, and another one behind us. This is how the streets look now. This is my neighborhood. We just came out of the street here in Hamas. This is Tel El Hawa. This is how it looks now. This was one of the nicest neighborhoods in Gaza City.
Tarek Abu Azum is live for us inside Gaza. Hello there, Tarek. Another night of terror ahead, no doubt. Tell us where you are and what's been happening since we last spoke.
Well, as the Israeli occupation forces are branding their attacks inside the Gaza Strip, the number of Palestinian victims is rising and surging. The Israeli occupation forces during the past hours have bombarded different areas inside the Gaza Strip, despite the fact that the majority of areas were displaced. They are trying to take down residential towers and to make the severe damage to the Palestinian public property. Till this current moment, according to the Palestinian Ministry of Health, the death toll has risen to reach 1,900 victims, with approximately around 7,000 others wounded. This great number of injured people needs a very intervention from the medical staff here inside the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, the Palestinian hospitals are facing such a great shrink in medical supplies, which can really negatively impact on its ability to provide treatment for thousands of injured people who are just turn up in the Palestinian hospitals on regular basis as the Israeli bombardment to the Gaza Strip continues. It's also essential to mention that the number of casualties might be increased in the future if the Israeli strikes continues, specifically with the looming of the ground invasion that will be carried out by the Israeli occupation forces to the Gaza Strip, as it has been reported in media outlets. The Gazans here are living in a very great despair, desperate conditions. They are trying to afford the basic needs for themselves. In fact, these basic needs cannot be afforded. They are calling the international community to make an urgent intervention to rescue them from the collapse. You are talking about only 2 hours of electricity to some certain parts of the Gaza Strip, and this kind of electric current might not really be connected all the time. You are talking about let's say drugs warehouses for the Palestinian Ministry of Health is about to run out of medical drugs. You are talking about even the hospitals' capabilities won't be able to host more casualties if the Israeli ongoing closure continues on the Gaza Strip.
Okay, and Tarek, it's early hours on day 7 of this war. It's just past midnight in Gaza. How can the people there prepare, if all, for these relentless strikes?
Well, people in Gaza they are facing death every night. The shadow of death is looming everywhere inside the Gaza Strip. People we're talking about, let's say, more than 200,000 of Palestinians are living in shelters and in schools affiliated to the United Nations. Others are living with their relatives, while the rest remaining are living in the street. They are waiting for someone to rescue them from the misery that had been caused by the Israeli occupation forces. Now, they cannot really believe or even have hope in terms of reaching a ceasefire that might end their anguish. So it's important that the Palestinians here inside the Gaza Strip, they have been collectively punished by the Israeli occupation forces. They are not being protected due to the international law. Even the houses were bombarded while they are inside the house without prior warnings. The majority of casualties are among young kids and even women, without any respect to the principles of the international law. Palestinians really are calling for international protection for themselves, or even to afford them humanitarian corridors in order to be aided and to receive assistance that will enable them to continue and to stand alive in the future.
Okay, thanks so much, Tarek Abu Azoum in Gaza for us. A group of journalists, including an Al Jazeera team, has been hit by an Israeli strike in southern Lebanon. Reuters cameraman Issam Abdallah has been killed. Journalists from AFP were also injured in the Al-Lama al-Shab near the Israeli border. They were in a car when they were hit, as Peter Stemick reports.
This is what's left of the vehicle used by a group of journalists. They were struck while covering the escalating tensions near the southern Lebanese border with Israel. Reuters cameraman Issam Abdallah was killed, while Al Jazeera journalists Carmen Jokhadar and Eli Brachia were injured and taken to hospital.
This is what happened. All journalists were here together. It's a type of safety measure. This is to make sure that both the resistance and Israel know that we are journalists and in one location. I can clearly say that we, journalists, were targeted on purpose. We were far from the confrontations. The confrontations are up this hill over the horizon, where the fires are. This spot is where the journalist was. All of the journalists were wearing their safety kit. They all had press slogan on their chest and cars.
This is not the first time Israel has targeted journalists. Last year, Al Jazeera's Shireen Abu Akleh was shot dead by an Israeli sniper in the occupied West Bank. She was clearly marked as a journalist. No one was ever held accountable.
There was no one else around them. There was no fighting. There were no military points. The journalists were hit, and we have, so far with the information that we have, they all point to an intentionality that is difficult to refute. And in that case, we are talking about a war crime.
Journalists have also been killed in Gaza in the latest escalation. Unions have called for all parties to abide by international law and protect journalists. Peter Stemmet, Al Jazeera.
And Ali Hashim has more from Alma al-Shab in Lebanon, near where the attack on the journalists occurred.
I'm currently in Tyre, in front of the hospital where our colleagues are. As a matter of fact, this was a deliberate attack on a group of journalists who were clearly identified, and they were wearing their kits, having the press on their kits, on their helmets. Everything was there to prove and to show and to stress that they were journalists. This group of journalists, and I was actually with my colleague Rad, we were with them, and then we separated. We went to somewhere else, and they decided to go to this hill that was overlooking the whole area. So we were in this area for the past 4 or 5 days, going and coming back and forth. The Israeli army that's monitoring this road on the border line knew very well that this group of journalists are moving together from one place to another. We were in the morning in Marwahin, then we came to the Haira, then we separated, and then they launched their shells on our colleagues. I was with our colleague Carmen Jo Khadar here at this hospital. We met her, we spoke to her, made sure she's okay. She has a lot of injuries, but she's in a good situation. Our colleague also, Eli Brachia, he's also wounded and injured. Also, he's in a stable situation. Unfortunately, we lost our colleague from Reuters, Isam al-Abdallah. Unfortunately, it was how it happened. These journalists were hit, directly hit, deliberately hit, despite the fact clearly they were showing that they were journalists.
The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been holding meetings in the Middle East with regional leaders. He met the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas before finishing the day here in Qatar. Diplomatic editor James Bays has been following the day's events.
The Secretary of State arrived in Jordan, not on his normal jet, but on a US military plane, an indication that the difficult diplomatic situation he faces is also potentially a threat to his own security. He'll have heard plain speaking from Jordan's King Abdullah. Before heading for a meeting with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, camera crews and reporters filmed a handshake between the two before being quickly escorted out. As he continued his tour of the region, the US's top diplomat will have been aware that criticism of Israel's tactics was now coming from many others in addition to the Palestinian president. The UN, the International Committee of the Red Cross and the World Health Organization were all denouncing the order for people in Gaza City and the north to move southwards. In Qatar, Secretary Blinken met with the Emir, Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, a leader who maintains links with Hamas as well as the West. And Secretary Blinken then publicly laid out the two areas where they're working together.
We discussed in detail our efforts to prevent any actor, state or non-state, from creating a new front in this conflict. We're also working intensively together to secure the release of hostages, including American citizens, being held by Hamas in Gaza. I'm grateful for the urgency that Qatar is bringing to this effort.
But there's a key difference in the approach of the two countries. Qatar's Prime Minister made it clear his nation wants an immediate ceasefire in Gaza.
We cannot deprive the people in Gaza from electricity, water, and medicine, and like all the means of life. we believe that the situation is very dangerous.
This is the longest tour of the Middle East that the Secretary of State has made. In total, he's visiting 7 countries. In each one, he's stressing Israel's right to self-defense. But there are many in the Arab world that believe this indiscriminate and devastating, but in fact revenge and collective punishment. James Bayes, Al Jazeera, at the Emiri Dirwan in Doha.
Let's bring in Marwan Bashara. He is Al Jazeera's senior political analyst and joins us from Paris. Hello there, Marwan. There are certainly lots of regional players that are trying to either avoid being drawn into this war or calling for restraint. What should we be looking out for as these many diplomatic meetings are carried out?
Well, it depends on what happens in the next few hours and days. Clearly, the clouds of death are gathering over Gaza depending on how grave, how tragic, how bloody the situation is going to get, how many people will be touched by death, I think will determine the kind of responses we're going to see from regional leaders and, in fact, from international leaders. Because for the time being, we see some serious polarization, with Israel actually standing firm about crushing Hamas, unconditionally supported by the United States and Western powers in general, while in the Middle East, people are looking with alarm at the escalation in Palestine that will probably overspill, at least in terms of sentiments and instability, to their own societies because of the very organic relationship between Palestinians and the rest of the Arab societies. So I think the next few days and the urgency of the situation, the terrible escalation to be expected, will probably put pressure on more and more leaders, including those at the United Nations, to ask for a ceasefire and to ask for Israel to hold back. Unfortunately, the way I see it, analytically speaking, Israel is determined now to go all the way. So unless some of its grown-up partners decide to act like grown-ups and put an end to this, I think we are approaching slowly but surely to an Armageddon.
Marwan, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres commented before the Security Council meeting. He said even wars have rules. What did you make of his comments?
Well, absolutely. That's just stating the obvious, right? And I'm glad he finally came out with it and stating some of those, some of those points clearly, at least, in terms of taking a stand, because that's what you expect the Secretary General of the United Nations to do. It is unfortunate that so many of the, world powers are either indifferent or are becoming hysterical. And hence, a sober or a sobering voice from the Secretary General is important now, just to remind everyone that is being so hysterical in their support of Israel, especially, that there are laws of war and that they should be respected, and that the starvation and the bombardment of civilians is a clear cut violation of international law. It's not just. It's like I'm also now speaking in cliches. It's just a terrible, violent, immoral, unethical, bloody, inhumane, right, punishment of an entire population. As I've heard it before, this is no longer an act of self-defense. This is, as our correspondent put it, this is an act of revenge, indiscriminate killing and bombings of an entire population.
Do you think, given the number of civilian deaths in Palestine is rising, that is damaging Israel's international reputation at all?
Here's again another one of those code words, right? International. We've certainly heard from the likes of the Chinese, who make up 25% of the world population or so, saying that the central cause, the root cause of this entire problem is Israel and its supporters' denial of basic rights to the Palestinian people. But China does not really count nowadays, as Western leaders have basically monopolized the issue of Israel-Palestine. And as we see now from the movement of the Secretary of State, shuttling between Israel and Arab states, that basically the United States is telling everyone, don't. Don't meaning what? Don't interfere. Don't meaning what? Don't even think of getting involved, which means the United States is basically telling the world, Israel is under our protection, and Israel can do whatever Israel wants to do as long as it needs to do it. And the United States, with its armadas in the East Mediterranean, will be there to support it and to protect it as it's carrying basically what's going to be looking more and more like a genocide against the Palestinians, where we're going to see perhaps tens or hundreds of thousands of casualties in the weeks and months to come.
Do you have any hope of meaningful action coming out of that Security Council meeting that is, I believe, wrapped up this evening?
I don't, because I hear what Western powers are saying. And, you know, at least in the Security Council, we have England, France, and the United States. You know, 3 out of 5 permanent members are clearly not coalescing. And all 3 leaders are channeling the ugly reality and the genocidal sound bites from the Israeli Prime Minister. The Israeli Prime Minister says a number of things. President Biden repeats them. His Secretary of State then repeats them. And then it just, you know, trickles down to the English and the French and the German and so on. So we have a situation now where the West is living within its own ecosystem, basically united unconditionally behind Israel. Instead of trying to restrain Israel, they're basically now telling Israel or giving Israel a carte blanche to do what Israel wants. The problem with all of this can be summarized, Emily, in one word: hysteria. There is a certain hysteria, a certain hysterical response to what happened a week ago. And I think instead of people holding back and pulling away from the brink, what they are doing is that they are throwing fuel on the fire. And that is a problem. We've seen that happen 20 years ago. And I say 20 years Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and why Hamas is even worse than ISIS, a so-called war on terror. And we know what that brought us. Millions of casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan, a total chaos in the Middle East, terrible polarization between the West and the Muslim world, ending up 20 years later with the United States and its Western allies pulling away, humiliated from Afghanistan and later from Iraq. It all went for a huge catastrophe in our hands, and we don't seem to learn from the lessons of history. Hamas is not ISIS. Hamas is an anti-colonial movement that does use certain, unsavory methods, including terrorism, but it's clearly a nationalist movement that wants justice and liberty within its own homeland. It's not going out on an international violence, spree of violence. So in that sense, there is a solution. Unlike Al-Qaeda and ISIS, where there is no solution, here there's a clear-cut solution, which we and the international community have been talking about for the past 75 years, or at least for the past 55 years. And there are United Nations resolutions